Dear public, dear guests, dear speakers, welcome to our newly opened Aga Khan Centre in the heart of contemporary London, King's Cross Quarter. Tonight it's our second lecture from our series entitled Cultural Heritage, Urban Architecture and Creativity in Muslim Settings. This series of 10 public events interrogates how architecture, planning and contemporary creativity enhance and affects both quality of life and sustainability in a range of Muslim contexts. This lecture series is organized by the Aga Khan University and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. Our esteemed guests and speakers tonight are Cameron Rashti and Anthony Wayne. I would like to give them a very warm welcome. Anthony Wayne is a professional landscape architect trained at the universities of Reading and Sheffield, and then in public service and private practice for over 30 years in South Africa. His work in landscape planning and landscape architecture encompass World Heritage Sites, city parks and major mixed development projects, conservation landscapes, historic gardens, and the landscapes of winery, race courses, marina, and destination resorts. Cameron Rashti is an architect and project manager with extensive project experience on major sites in North America, Europe, and Middle East. He joined the Geneva-based Aga Khan Trust for Culture in 1994 as a deputy director. Since 2006, he is the director of the Historic City Program, consisting of a portfolio of conservation, restoration, and urban regeneration projects in various parts of the developing world, with an emphasis on environmental and community socio-economic development and preservation of historic districts. Within the Historic City Program, Cameron was, amongst other tasks, responsible for the implementation of the Al-Azhar Park project in Egypt. And it's during this project that I met him for the very first time, when I was doing my excavations on the Fatimid and Ayyubid walls in Cairo. 1 month ago, for those who were with us 1 month ago, we had our first lecture and we were introduced to contemporary architecture, housing and building environment. Tonight we will see what forms of relationship of the urban habitat and nature can take and what templates historic cities offer. Cameron Rashti and Anthony Wayne will complement on the AKTC Historic City Program projects from historic gardens and landscape sites across the Muslim world, and present case studies spanning a quarter of century of projects in Egypt, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Canada. Before giving the floor to speakers, I would like to inform you that we have an exhibition on Muslim architecture of the Indian Ocean on the first floor, room 110. And the exhibition displays the heritage and conservation projects in Tanzania, the Maldives, and India. You are most welcome to visit this exhibition, and our communication team will guide you there at the end of the lecture. Thank you again, and a warm welcome to our guest speakers.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan, for the warm introduction, and it was wonderful to be introduced by an old friend and colleague.
Excuse me, could you use the microphone?
I thought I would be able to project my voice, but I obviously not. So it's a pleasure to be introduced by Stefan Praudina, a very old friend and colleague, and who we met in fieldwork. And I think one of the distinguishing features of the work of the Historic Cities Program is how we combine professional practice and theory and field work. As you will see in our various projects. We have a number of case studies to show you. Just a few initial words, and then I think as we go through the presentation, we'll have lots to say. We had an excellent tour of this wonderful building this afternoon, where you have showcases of 4 or 5 wonderful miniature gardens reflecting very important garden traditions within the Muslim world. And we see how His Highness the Aga Khan has had the vision of not only undertaking projects in South Asia, Africa, Middle East, etc., but also to bring those examples and those traditions into the Western world and into institutions such as this institution. So it's very gratifying to see that connection and that interrelationship, etc., and the way in which all of these projects reinforce each other. And of course, His Highness was recently in Canada and inaugurated the Aga Khan Gardens in Edmonton, which is, I haven't seen it, but I've seen the drawings, and we have some examples here, and it's also a very impressive project. Anthony Wayne is, as you heard, is a practicing architect and has collaborated with us in a number of these projects, and so we'll both be giving explanations of these projects. In general, parks are much more complex than they may seem, parks and gardens. Many people think of them as a mirror of their own society, but the mirror, of course, has to be designed, and it has a certain way of transmitting back a message and a structure. And I think you'll see in this series of case studies that the parks and gardens can, in our portfolio, have tried to stress local identity, genius loci, as is often referred to, which has to be unique to any space you're in. We're not producing templates that are repeated endlessly. At least that's our ambition. And these spaces, especially in countries where environmental standards are low and green space is very scarce, these projects are extremely vital once finished as spaces for congregation, assembly, and leisure space. Well, with that few introductory remarks, I'll pass the microphone to Anthony, and then we'll get going with the presentation. Thank you again.
Looks like I'm going to do some magic, but I'm not. Just to clarify, I'm actually a landscape architect, not an architect. Otherwise, I would be wearing it as a jacket. I originally trained as a horticultural scientist. That's quite important to know. And then I trained as a landscape architect. And what I found out when I started practicing landscape architecture was that landscape architecture is less about plants and planting and botany, and it's more about people. It's a social science, as Cameron described quite elegantly. It's about upliftment, and it's people's experience of a city. So it's not the sort of designery, soft, easy sort of job you might think it's going to be. It's a much more gritty interaction with people, and if they're poor people, then they live largely in the public environment. So it's very, very important the public environment is actually raised to improve their lives, far more than richer people who have many other diversions and their own resources. With poorer people in urban situations particularly, then they actually share everything. They share their lives, they share the parks, and that's what landscape architecture was intended to do, defined by an American landscape architect called Olmsted. He saw it as a place for people to socialize and civilize together in a park, so hence Central Park in New York, which was one of the first. So that's the intellectual bit from me. I'm telling you that I think a city park is perhaps the best example of a democratic public institution that I can imagine. I mean, it's important, it's as important as voting, because it's shared space and it's common to everybody. It empowers, uplifts, cultivates, exercises, all comers. The public park doesn't turn anybody away. And with those as your criteria to design with, it's actually quite exacting. Private clients who want you to design expensive gardens for them are impossible because they want everything. People in public parks are different. They're actually very good to engage with. We've all benefited from this, and it gives you a much bigger picture on life and perhaps philosophy generally. So that's the technical side. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. So we're standing between you and these projects themselves. So I think we should start the presentation. And we'll have to try our best to, as you in the audience, to look at the screen so we can explain what we're seeing at the same time. Okay, thank you. Maybe I'm too quick with this. I don't think I have to spend much time discussing the Al-Rahan Development Network to this group and the different sectors and you're part of this network, after all, many of you. And just to show briefly that the Al-Rahan Trust for Culture is here, if I can get this, it's under the cultural pillar on the far right, and it consists of a number of programs. As Stefan Pradin mentioned, you had there was a presentation a few weeks ago by the Al-Rahan Award for Architecture, and today the work being presented is of the Historic Cities program. Yeah. Ah, yes. No wonder. Thank you. That solves that. So projects we're presenting today are displayed geographically on this map. You can see there's quite a leap from West Africa to southeastern Africa, Egypt, and the South Asian region, plus Central Asia, and which has, of course, I think you would agree, Anthony, that required us to have different solutions and to deal with quite a variety of environments.
Yeah, you made the point, you made a good point about templates, is you can't have a template, you can't have fixed ideas, which sound very elegant in French, because you're changing environments and you're changing cultures as you go. So you can't have a one-fit-all sort of design. So that's why it's actually sort of an interesting set of projects.
We also, as we proceed with these projects, we have to be aware of the greater global situation. It's very well known that the world is now largely urbanized, and in all parts of the world, and it's becoming increasingly so. The world population continues to grow. This is something which exerts more and more pressure on cultivable land and cityscapes, and you see on the far right the urban-rural breakdown, and of course the fact that rural population is declining. So first conclusion, larger cities, more people living in cities, more need for parks, and more stress on the environment, urban environment, and ecological systems.
Yeah, one statistic you actually quoted, which I saw just about a week ago in the newspaper, was Bamako, one of the cities we're going to look at shortly, in Mali, is going to increase 95% in the next 10 years. So that's incredible pressure. It's not a European type of pressure. It's a third world pressure.
Another interesting comparison of population by region, showing that a lot of the growth is in places where we actually work. So South Asia, India, Pakistan, and not China as of now, but nonetheless parts of Africa. So the needs are not only more acute globally across the board, but in these specific areas. And so our projects, we feel, in other words, an even more urgent need when we develop parks or rehabilitate historic gardens, etc., that they can serve larger and larger numbers of people. And I'll come back to this later in Lahore. Again, another view of urban configurations and the large densities which are emerging. We also are working in parts of the world which fall within the Silk Route, which has become an interesting topic for the public today. Lots being written about the Silk Route from all sorts of angles. As a bridge between East and West, you have bestsellers out now about the Silk Route as being actually the central historical nexus for the spread of civilization and so on and so forth. This map just shows the constellation of major cities along the Silk Route, and it also shows the maritime Silk Route, which Stefan and I and Anthony were talking about earlier. So we are interested in the Indian Ocean maritime culture and civilization, as well as the terrestrial civilization and patterns of trade across Central Asia and elsewhere. Well, the park projects that we work on inevitably deal with both public and private realms. We know, and there is of course a overlap, and there's a blurring, so I'm not to suggest that these are completely distinct and watertight, but our projects are very often in public spaces, metropolitan parks, hillside terraces, historic gardens, even baulis in historic parts of cities such as Delhi. There are, within the parks, there are public buildings which obviously serve the public and involve museum spaces, health clinics, conference areas, etc. And there are also even private buildings within public spaces that are of interest to us, restaurants, etc., run by the private sector. And then finally, private spaces with courtyards, etc. And in this building, as we said earlier, you have sort of an example of this phenomenon. You have, in a sense, you have vest pocket size gardens, which are public-private. I mean, they're available to a certain public which comes to the building and would like to visit them on guided tours, etc., and to the people who work in this facility.
Well, it also follows on that many of these sites are so big, they're not just, don't have just one purpose. They can have a conservation purpose, be it archaeological, or be it from a historic point of view, buildings or other artifacts, or even monuments. It can be so big, in some of the schemes, it can have a natural area, almost like a nature conservation area, and then there's always a demand, a pent-up demand in overcrowded cities for just sport and recreation to occur somewhere. So if these big open spaces can actually serve many purposes, being sort of a mixed media type of design, then you've got more chance of succeeding. The bigger the audience, the more chance you've got of succeeding. Could be a few more people here, that would help.
Okay, so now the role of landscape design today, if Anthony would prevent me, I'm not a landscape architect, I'm an architect, but so we're reversing roles. But we were talking about this prior in our preparations for the presentation, and we both believe that landscape design has moved away from a serene and sort of contemplative stage setting role, where people just roam around and just would observe nature and feel relaxed and soothed. They've become important, vital parts of cities. They are, in fact, they're essential parts of urban tissue. And there are practitioners today, I'm not sure how many of you come across regularly, but who believe that they would go further and say landscape has become a form of urbanism. Because the gardens and parks have buildings, they have architecture in them. They have a lot of complex infrastructure, facilities, etc. Public spaces, stages, theaters. So there are some who will say that they're mini cities. And you'll see in the case of Lahore Fort, it's a city really in itself. Landscape is also architecture in the case of hardscape and plazas and so on. And as I said earlier, they are miniature cities. Azhar Park, which you'll see shortly, Humayun's tomb, Baghe, Babur, Lahore Fort, these, there really are self-contained complexes which are within complex cities, which means that their management and the way they're used and their signage systems, everything, security is very complex as well.
So if I can add to that, so in emerging cities, in these crowded cities of newly sort of growing economies and intensely, densely occupied living space, there is very little space to actually be a normal person. You're living tightly with your family, you're working tightly in sort of the work and industrial situations. So parks, as a great big area of common space, become the places you go take the family for a picnic or you go to play, because there aren't alternatives. There aren't micro parks in the street. The streets might not be safe. They're usually full of traffic. The cities are polluted. So the park, these big parks we're speaking about, are actually really a contrast to a metropolitan situation. They're an alternative, which are clean, green, safe open spaces, and that has huge appeal because in the sort of the growing populations of the world, everybody's having families. There are all these families with nowhere to recreate, nowhere to have normal family moments because their lives are abnormal, and that's why it's very important. So if they want to have a retirement party, they want to have an engagement party, they want to have a birthday party for the kids. They seek out these spaces because it's got everything they want. They can access them. They're clean and green. It's probably cleaner than where they live in their living environment. So it's extremely special to them. And the number of photographs that all these parks actually occur in the background of is they literally are the backdrop to real life in these cities. And without the park, they would have no alternative. There would be a photograph against the building. And it sounds very sentimental, but landscape architecture and parks like this have a romantic connotation or a sentimental connection to families. And in growing cities, that's really fundamentally important to their well-being.
So, in summary, they can be viewed from many perspectives, and we'll see many of them today. On this list, which is by no means complete, I would say that the items which are near the top are more commonly understood, and the lines nearer to the bottom are perhaps less frequently considered. For example, you may not often think of a park as an agent for urban change. Well, we'll see some examples, or that it's a component of the microeconomy or refuge area, etc. But let's now proceed and look at some of these examples. So we've selected a number of projects in these countries that we mentioned, and we have to bear in mind that our mission in AKTC in general, the Historic Cities Program, as written here, is to undertake urban regeneration projects in historic cores, spurring social, economic, and cultural development to improve the quality of life of the communities. So we have a special condition attached to the park portfolio. We don't develop parks just for the sake of developing parks as leisure parks. We don't do entertainment parks as such just for entertainment. They have to serve the public and the community that's carefully selected. Now, we'll start with Al-Azhar Park, which I was involved with since 1994. This became a precursor to many of the projects and park projects that were done by AKTC in later periods, and you'll see in these slides. It's a 30-hectare site. His Highness the Aga Khan selected the site, knowing it was a complex and a challenging site with very unstable soils. The soil quality was very salty, which had to be moderated. We had the need for special foundation systems, as you'll see in pictures, and it was and very large. Therefore, the big question: how do you deal with a park built out of a barren space?
It was technically a rubbish dump, wasn't it?
It
historically,
was, yes.
It's a big rubbish dump.
That's right.
Great start.
I tend to sort of let's glide over that aspect, but it's quite true. We had to remove a lot of waste. Well, I think one of the answers is that is shown here, that this is a very historic section of Cairo called Jabal Ahmar, and this is the historic wall built by the Ayyubids, but following the original wall system built by the Fatimids, who after all founded the city of Cairo, and that Stefan Pardin has spent many years researching in the north. So in other words, this tract of land, as large as it was and as barren as it was full of associations and connections with the historic city of Cairo, which is a World Heritage Site, UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's located here in the city of Cairo, modern-day Greater Cairo. It's a general area called Dirasa Hills. Jabal Ahmar is here, and this zone, irregular zone with dotted lines, is the heart of what was the Fatimid Cairo and the walled enclosed city originally. On the other side of a major avenue is the City of the Dead, famous City of the Dead, cemeteries, and some more on this side. Jabal Ahmar we'll refer to also as we go along, because we can't separate, as I said earlier, parks from the communities. We cannot do a park project and ignore the community adjacent to it. That's one of the conditions. These are the wall systems, and Stefan, you're the expert, in-house expert on all of these, and you've probably worked all along these areas with excavations and documentation. But the park, the area in which they intersect with the park is here. This long section in this triangle, which is the same long as here, a very interesting area that we'll come back to.
Yeah. Just a point of principle is, in England in the 17th century, where there were parterre gardens everywhere, if you were the next landscape architect in, you would use dynamite or blow up the previous scheme and then build a capability brown landscape. So you destroy things as you go. Behind all these projects, AKTC projects, there's an element of retaining portions of everything. So a matter of discovery, the Anubic wall was actually integrated into the design of the park. So it collects things and it adapts as it goes along. That's very important from a cultural point of view, and actually makes it a lot more interesting and versatile as a park. So it's not usual to do things like this. And normally things are separated.
I think we'll have to move along fairly quickly if you want to get there. Thank you, Anthony. This is a diagram of the area of the community we got involved with, which we consider the catchment area in terms of immediate impact, and a number of monuments and areas where we had action areas or identified and numbered. As I said, the park is 30 hectares, a very, very irregular shape. You see superimposed on the site the ultimate or the final layout of the design, which we'll come to. Here's a view of a photograph of the park at in the early 20th century, with shows already the mounds of dirt that had accumulated. This is a watercolor by David Roberts in the 19th century, showing the Ayyubi wall. And this is a very complicated pointer. Thank you. And the way in which these walls are being gradually covered, famous monuments of Cairo, and this was the site as we saw it in 1994 and walked through it with His Highness the Aga Khan and asked ourselves how to proceed with this. More historic photos. Well, the methodology for the first few years was all geotechnology and earth movement and cut and fill and careful gradation using mini bulldozers, because we had to work on very steep slopes. And this was to grade it to the shape of the master plan. And these large circular concrete tank tops are for the municipal water system that the municipality decided to introduce to the site as well. This is the general site plan, and of course there was a lot of analysis of the different levels of soil. We had to keep track very carefully of the huge amounts of soil being moved about, so we had periodic surveys done with the elevation shown, so we could do calculations of the overall volumes being moved around, and then new soil added. The final master plan is shown on the bottom picture and an aerial view on the right. Basically, we have created more than 200 jobs, long-term jobs. We continue to operate the park under a PPP agreement with the government of Cairo. There is an amount of cash flow generated for the local economy of over $4 million, and the park project was just under $30 million to build. Views from, I'll be quick, views from the air in the finished park. It's a very popular park. It relied on a number of historic precedents drawn from different parts of the Islamic world to create a main spine from a very high-level hilltop restaurant down through a tank top covered with geometric gardens, a main spine. It turns and pivots and then goes towards a artificial lake that was created, which gives us a reservoir of water, approximately 10 days water supply, if water should be interrupted in the street. Some pictures of the final results, including a lakeside cafe. Extremely popular with the public. It's a place of refuge people go to during the day as well as at night, especially on Eids. Sometimes we have as many as 30,000 people in a day at the high points. There is a pay-to-enter system, so that, and the proceeds of those ticket payments support the irrigation, the park maintenance, the entire operations. It runs a surplus. The surplus is plowed back into the community that I indicated. And one of the charming aspects of the park is that it's at a higher altitude, so you can see the historic rooftops and mosques and minarets, which Cairo is famous for.
Well, it's possibly the cleanest park you've ever been to in a dusty city that you can ever go to. It's remarkable.
Examples of people using it and when it's empty. This is the entry plaza as an example. Getting to be almost King's Cross densities, I would say. We have many views, but I just go quickly through these. I'd like to move to a project which came later in 2002, right after the fall of the former regime and the creation of the new government, Islamic government of Republic of Afghanistan. And you see, these images are very much what the city looked like at that time, devastated. This is a park, this is a site or project which is purely a historic garden created by the Emperor Baghe Babur on terraces. So it follows the hilltop terrace historic design approach to gardens with a central channel which cascades down into little pools and continues, and with a number of important buildings on the principal axis, but also off of it. This is a view of the garden in 2002, before we started work. You've seen this, I think, before, Anthony.
Yeah.
And you visited this because there was a very careful research done by a landscape architect based in Delhi, Mohammed Shahir, Dr. Mohammed Shahir, who established, put together records that he could find about the historic plant species, because Baghe Babur, the Emperor's Garden, was meant to be a private leisurely garden where he would escape from the heat of the plains of South in Asia and India, and he would be able to enjoy fruits in all seasons and see greenery and have fresh air and water. And he would basically camp out on the high terraces and just enjoy this experience.
Yes, I mean they were flower-filled terraces. They were flowering trees. It was actually really quite a sensuous landscape on a gigantic scale. Not architectural like the French.
After it was rehabilitated and with new trees and proper walkways and trying to follow the historic precedents wherever we could, it was open to the public. And this table gives you a sense of the number of people visiting. We have, again, we operate the park in conjunction with the municipality of Kabul under what is called now the Kabul Historic Gardens Trust. And so this is an important aspect. We have, by finishing projects and co-managing with local authorities, we have helped them to develop an institutional framework for proper park management, which was not in place before. And we don't insist on staying in places, but we're often requested to stay to make sure, to ensure that they are well managed and properly maintained. Some details. This is again a sign of how popular the parks are. Can you imagine in Kabul today, even with explosions going on, several a day in different parts of the town, people make a point to travel here with their families so they could have a few hours of relaxation and peace and to enjoy nature. I think this is really quite a tribute.
Yeah, sometimes they come for the day because it's so calm and quiet inside behind these high earthen walls going all the way around that it's a total contrast to the craziness that's happening outside. Even the traffic is crazy in Kabul.
Yeah. So aerial view from above. You'll see that we believe a lot in aerial photography. Now it's becoming easier and easier to be able to convey the extent. There is a Queen's Palace, so to speak, former Haram Sarai here. There's a mosque which was built by a descendant of Emperor Babur, the Shah Jahangi Mosque, and his grave is in an enclosure, wall enclosure here in a pavilion, which was with special carved panels. In the south, at the end of this main axis, is a zone which was created. This part is new, which is a ticketing point and some limited amenities, tea house, etc., for people coming in, and the space for some musical performances at certain times of the day. Views of the mosques that I mentioned just now and the Haram Sarai on the interior. Well, this is a very recent project in Kabul. This project that I just showed you, the Baghe Babur, was so successful in terms of the number of people visiting and the demand for this space that we were approached by in this case, the German Federal Foreign Office, and said, we'd like to do a cultural project, and would you be able to carry it out for us? And we said yes, and they said, why don't you please look at a number of sites and propose? This was one of the sites proposed, and this is 100% funded by the German government. And I would ask Anthony to take us through this project. Just finished, by the way. Do you need this?
I'll try without it. Yeah, it's amazing because I come from South Africa to work there, somewhere where you go to where there's snow, so that was a surprise for me. It's actually a end of the 19th century King's Park, basically, King Amanullah. And it's a walled garden, very much as you might expect in the situation of Kabul. And it's actually got topography to it, which is unusual. You can see it's actually got a central point here, which is a place where a palace was created on top of a hillock, giving you overviews over the gardens beneath. So you get wonderful extension of views. And it's currently surrounded by informal and some semi-formal housing. So what once would have been farmland and fields sweeping up to it, and orchards in particular, is now in very much an urban situation. There was some diagrams we did in the beginning to try and understand the landscape of it all, and it was turned into a park somewhere in the after the actual palace ceased to be used, and the park was actually also had a wall around it. It was a recreation of the original wall. It had rose gardens and orchards. It had central areas of large tree plantings of wonderful pine trees and coniferous species you get in that area, really like an arboretum. It had mass plantings around the side of the sort of citadel on top, and the cliffs of the rocky outcrop of wild roses. Wild roses come from China and India. Fantastic, antique roses, rambling roses. And they've just grown naturally, and they beautifully sort of cascade over the rock faces. And at the back, there's an old a water system, a lake, which was put in about sort of 30 or 40 years ago, I think, and then general forest. So it was a very interesting sort of mixed garden with fountains and waterways, all in carved marble. Very sort of European type garden, but in a Kabul climate. So quite unusual. And this gives you an idea of what the tree survey revealed to us. There are magnificent specimens of trees there. Very interesting things happening. There were opportunities for views outside the site, because when you do design a garden or even a park at this scale, you're still very interested in borrowed scenery. So we looked at areas which were off-site where interventions could happen in, again, largely sort of informal housing in these areas. And there would be the idea was to do something on the outside for the benefit of the community directly, rather than just concentrate on the inside of the park, which was going to be more managed. And we came up with a schematic master plan which tried to address conservation of all the factors that came from the original design of the palace gardens, all the existing trees that were worth conserving, because a gigantic 30-metre tree, which is 120 years old, is far more valuable in a public park than planting 1,000 new saplings. So you have to go cautiously in the beginning. So we saved a lot. A lot of these trees were saved in this design. And we picked up clues from the existing fountains and waterways to have a wet access going through the middle there, with a sort of central feature at the end, and for the original access avenue to be kept, because it was very well tree planted, it was there, and that was regenerated and actually put into the master planning design. And to keep the general layout, this grid layout you can see here, is what you always get in Muslim gardens. It's the shapes and the forms are driven by irrigation, and irrigation works in 90 degrees. So you have straight runs, and that's where the patterns of Islamic gardens from, is the science of irrigation, because they obviously came from dry countries, but they knew how to manipulate the climate and to make it great for people to live in. They made it a paradise, which is what the inevitable intention was. There you can see a bit more detail in sort of trees and the sort of spatial layout you have. What we try to do is create as many different spaces, many different spaces at different scales, so that many uses, people who wanted to be quiet and picnic can go in one direction, if people wanted to sit and actually watch other people pass by, or people wanted to go and play sport. There are cricket fields in here. Because Afghans actually love cricket above anything else, I think. There are areas to play their own type of football here, endless volleyball fields, because it's a very active place. Afghanistan has quite a young population, so they want to be active and they want to do sports. But on the other hand, they have an older population. You're old there when you get to 60. That's the life expectancy. So I'm feeling pretty grim about that, because I'm just on the edge of that. And this park then is designed for many people from different times of life and for many functions. And that's what it looks like, which is pretty convincing considering it was actually sort of not derelict, but it was in a very poor state when AKTC got involved. It was actually very compacted soil. The irrigation wasn't working anymore. It had been used as a site for a part of the war, and the building on top, the palace, had been heavily damaged in fighting. And it has turned now into this over just a few years with a green amphitheatre, many major trees and geometric layouts, and a restored wall around the outside edge. So this is an earth wall around the outside edge, which is about 5 meters high and half a meter thick, and it makes a huge difference. It cuts out the sound of the traffic. I mean, the main problem in Kabul, you might think it's violence, but the noise of the traffic and the clamour, it is actually very wearing. And this is actually a refuge. That's a refuge from what's happening down that street. You can see it there.
This may be a good time to show the video, which may also
Yeah, there you go.
give you a little bit of change in, from looking at flat pictures on the screen to something more three-dimensional, which I think will speak about the complexity of these projects. This is a 3-year, you have to remember this was a 3-year project. This is how it was when we started. It was damaged by a mortar and the fighting over the years.
These are picnic terraces to encourage people to use as much of the park as possible. Very important secure entrances for certain people and making sure that it's actually very safe and secure inside.
Well, I think there are just a few more slides left to show you the final product. But I think this project is a very good example of what we said earlier, that this is a park which, besides green space, it has now an auditorium for about 220 people. It has a palace for events and for rentals as well.
It has a restaurant.
Yes, it has food and beverage points distributed at restaurants. It has an artistic exhibition space, plus administrative offices, etc. So, I mean, we found that in Kabul, it was important to provide all of these ancillary types of facilities so that you encourage people to come. And it's a safe spot. There are not many safe spots in Kabul. At least as I know.
Amanullah Palace?
Yes,
right, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So why don't we just quickly complete that? You go back a second. This is the auditorium, without the cushion showing. So again, a facility that it really doesn't exist. It didn't exist until this project outside of one or two government facilities for government use. So we're very hopeful that it will be well used and well visited by the public.
And things were adaptively reused. That was an old pump house for the original irrigation system for the palace, and that's been turned into a restaurant tea room. And it relates to open spaces and areas where you can go and sit out and eat outside. Everything possible that could be recycled or adaptively reused was, including the palace, which is actually, you see, has been restored. Lots of artisanal work. I mean, this is the workmanship and the use of materials in this park is extraordinarily exquisite. Not what you necessarily expect to find in a park construction, but the pavings of fantastic stonework and timber work. It's really a delight.
So I think, in view of the time, I think we have to very quickly now go through just the last two or three examples we have to sort of round out this presentation.
Okay, shall I go quickly over these?
Please. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a Soviet-era park, which had wonderful mature trees in, but was totally derelict when we arrived on site. It had a very rundown revetment of stone and concrete along the edge of this river, and this is a glacial melt river which runs like crazy in summer and has great erosive energy. And basically the river was eating the park. The park didn't exist anymore. It had no sort of facilities, no grass. The major tree structure was left, but it had great potential because it was right in the heart of the city, right near the city centre, and had lots of character and the most amazing views from it. And it had running water next to it and a link to the river. So there were lots of opportunities here. All these trees were conserved during the construction process. I mean, with a normal construction, you'd actually get a contractor who comes in and actually demolishes half the trees. But here they were able to insinuate the design of the park into the existing tree canopy. So there wasn't going to be an instant park at the end, not have to wait 1 to 2 to 5 years for new trees to grow. Sometimes when you haven't got trees, you can't do that. But when you have got them, it's the wise thing to do. Again, artisanal opportunities were here enormously. They were very good at working with stonework. Stone was available locally on the sides of the mountains. So rather than start a quarry, you go and pick the stone up off the edge of the road almost, and then turn it into features like this, a waterworks, a fountain, which actually was very entertaining. Turn it into rose bowls. for very traditional types of park plantings. They're very beautiful, with rare sort of stonework and patterns like that. And perhaps the highest beach in the world. I think it's the highest beach. It's halfway up a mountain. It's got a link into the river, so the swimming pool fills up, and it's very, very hot here in summer. I think it goes up to about 35, 40 degrees. And so that's a link in with river water coming in there, an artificial beach created by bringing in sand, not a natural beach, but it comes from the river. And it gives the park a real sort of character to its, of its own. And in where that went, but in the winter months, that same swimming pool is turned into an ice skating rink because it's part of their culture there. And the Russians, when they were there, used to use it as an ice skating rink. And I think actually the skates were donated by the Canadian Ismailis. Actually,
that's right. There were volunteers who collected skates in Canada and sent them over because it is a very cold climate. So why not promote that? So I will maybe I could. I don't know what magic button to press, but I'll try to avoid that. Yeah. So in Delhi, you may have heard that we've been involved for since really 1998 with the Humayun's tomb site. First, it was the rehabilitation of the garden, historic garden, was a gift of His Highness Azhar Khan on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of independence. There was a parallel gift made to Pakistan. And then after finishing the garden, as often happens, the authorities approached us and said, what about the tomb, the mausoleum? And so we said, well, what would that involve? We talked with, at that moment, Prime Minister Jan Mohammed Singh. He said, why don't we develop a PPP agreement and work together? Cultural heritage is in India, and now also we find in Pakistan, has become a very creative form of collaboration between the public and private sectors. And there are now systems or techniques of corporate sponsorship which are being encouraged. So the whole atmosphere has changed in recent years. But we started out with the garden. And as you can see, there are a huge amount of things done since then. Why doesn't this advance? Okay. So eventually the project became larger. And we said, well, we're working in Humayun's tomb, but there's this wonderful green space across the street, which is a dilapidated nursery. And then you have the Nizamuddin Basti, the historic central sacred sort of space of in this zone with dargah, baulis, with shrines, multiple shrines, etc., and mosques. So we decided to include that because, as we said earlier, we want to include communities in these projects. It's not just to have people come in by car or bus and walk around and have a few hours of pleasure in a park, although that is critically important, as we've just said, but we want to help local communities and tie them in in terms of jobs and so on. So we have been working, while we worked on conservation and other projects, we've been working in the Basti. I don't have time today to talk about these types of community socioeconomic projects, but perhaps that will be another presentation at a later date. But it's been intensive since the signing of the PPP agreement in 2007, which has been twice extended and now runs until 2022. This is Humayun's tomb complex, which I think is a dazzling sight to see. If anyone who can make it to the site, it's very much worth the visit, no matter what time of the year. The mausoleum itself is considered a precursor to the Taj Mahal. It has this is the mausoleum of Humayun, and obviously it borrows heavily from Persian architectural elements and motifs, as well as including a very interesting local flair and workmanship in the materials selected. Some various views and lesser monuments. This is Isfahan mausoleum on the same site. So these became big precincts with multiple dignitaries buried in proximity to the emperor. This is the garden after, one shot of the garden after restoration. Heavily visited today and also of use to school children, as you see here. In terms of this particular key area of land, this is remember this is mausoleum and this is the overall precinct. This is the entry zone, and we've decided to create, to better explain the entire site. It is after all a World Heritage Site. is to develop the Sundar Nursery, which would be able to absorb some of the pressure of crowds, so that is, that if people want to go and picnic, they don't have to do it right on the mausoleum lawn, but there's be space and benches for that. And then a museum, a site museum or interpretation center, which is under construction right now at the entry point. So people would come, instead of these strange little flimsy kiosks where you buy a ticket, etc. A proper museum, a proper place where you can enter, you can get information about the site maps, and you can actually have a pre-visit, so to speak, which will be of this nature, being built with elements explaining not only Humayun's tomb but the Nizamul Basti culture, etc. I mean, in a sense, this building is a similar type of facility, except here we don't have classes or courses. We have a rich array of cultural information to introduce to anyone who's visiting. This is a section. It's underground so that it will not conflict with World Heritage Site principles of respect and distances and not blocking views, etc. In Hyderabad, we've also been busy with this site, which is a large site of a Shia dynasty, the Qutb Shahi dynasty, roughly parallel to the Mughals, who managed to remain semi-independent of the Mughals with probably some degree of patronage and sort of seigniorage, and a magnificent site which we're also working on in terms of restoration and garden rehabilitation. This is a multi-year project. And they came to us, in this case Hyderabad, and said, we'd like you to come to Hyderabad and do what you've done in Delhi. We're waiting for the next city to approach us, because it's very time-consuming, these projects. Is
it the Golconda somewhere?
Golconda is just across the street from this. Very good. Yeah, absolutely. And we had talked about creating a link, because Golconda is a fabulous attraction point. Well maintained by ASI, not bad, in fact. Now, Pakistan Lahore is very up-to-date work. We're in the middle of we're nearly complete with a Lahore Fort Conservation Master Plan, which is going to be presented to UNESCO in early November in Paris, which will basically sets the rules and terms for the restoration of the fort conservation and its reuse. It's very exciting, and this will lead in conjunction with multiple donors in a multi-year project of restoration. But this is a walled city, and it's an amazing place. I know that some in the audience come from Lahore or have seen the site. This big structure on the up here is the Badashahi Mosque by itself, huge. This is the fort, but this is the whole walled city, the historical walled city. And we became involved with it in 2007 on the back of this project in partnership with the World Bank, which involved upgrading urban spaces. This is not purely landscape, but I wanted to explain how we got involved with the fort and rehabilitating and taking away the wires, putting infrastructure underground and cleaning shop fronts and restoring monuments. And this is a project Anthony will recognize, the circular gardens on the outside of the walls, upgrading those because those had been heavily encroached. And then you have the fort. What can you say? It's World Heritage Site. It's combined right now with the Shalimar Gardens site. To the north is Iqbal Park with the Minare Iqbal, Independence celebrations here. They have remodeled this on their own based on some master planning we did, but they deviated. But the important thing is it's been upgraded. They took a very heavily congested road away from there that we had recommended. Now we're going to deal with these urban buffer zones, as we call it, and to work on a phase-by-phase basis with the conservation of the fort.
Yes, the heavy traffic around the fort actually shapes the road. It is so intensely used.
It's a very complex, I made a reference earlier at the beginning of the presentation about these sites being almost mini cities with multiple building structures which were incrementally added, such as these over the years, starting with Emperor Akbar, then proceeding to Jahangir, then Shah Jahan, then so on, and then Shah Borj quadrangle at the end, which is probably maybe the most sophisticated, with the famous picture wall, which wraps around this facade, which you see here, and which is heavily dilapidated, and we're now conserving with a team of Pakistani and international conservators. A very tricky work. This is now, if you go there today, this is scaffolded and under restoration. this whole site. And this will be an important contribution to the safeguarding of cultural heritage in Pakistan.
Yes.
These are important water elements that Anthony talked about earlier, which are the central features of many of these courtyard buildings. There are many sheets of analysis. I won't
What's missing from these
detain you on
pictures is
this.
the pattern has threads of the sort of original Muslim patterning in, but the grass was basically put over by the British to make it clean and to deal with it. So the abundance of plant life and the abundance of trees and alignments and cypresses, which you'd normally expect to see in a Muslim sort of special place, they're not there. But there are fragments of it, and there's plenty of pictorial evidence in all sorts of miniatures and ceramics to suggest what was there. So this is going to be a bit of a case of detective work.
The new Conservation Master Plan report, which I mentioned, is nearly 500 pages long. And I think we'll make sure to get copies on deposit here, so you can, those who wish to delve into it can. Just other views to show you we're trying to demonstrate to UNESCO how we can revive certain historic fountains. It's rather sad that visitors go today and these are dry fountains. There's no water in them. So, people don't quite understand what were the significance of these spaces, etc. And then Anthony Wayne's team, who was recently there, and I should say in the monsoon season, saw the flooding of areas and ponding effect. And so now there's a whole area of research into drainage and evacuation of water.
Yeah, the Mughals were very good engineers and they were very good landscape architects, and they actually seamlessly put the two things together. So these parks actually worked like engineering devices, and the water came from gravity. So it's an extraordinary piece of work.
So and study of landscaping, which will continue. So I would say stay tuned. This project is going to be very interesting, and we'll hope to share with you videos and final images later. Well, I think there are just two last projects in Mali, in Africa, Mali and Zanzibar. If we have another 5 minutes, if everyone allows, to sort of wrap it up for people. Anthony, do you want to flip through these very quickly? Because you have 3 minutes for this and 3 minutes for Zanzibar. Or else...
That's not difficult, is it? It's like condensing 10 years of my life into 3 minutes. Right. This was originally detention scheme by the colonial French in the 1930s. So it was just actually grass and a few trenches and detention ponds. And it turned into a botanical garden. And what you see there are the remnants of the botanical garden, the mango trees. They tried every commercial species they could possibly think of growing in their new colony. And this park was the result of it. And it did become a public park. They had very much a colonial background. That's a master plan. By actually surveying all the trees on site and the natural river that flows through the site, which was part of the detention scheme, we found a way to turn what was an old-fashioned, extremely run-down botanical garden full of vicious, thorny creepers, to turn it back into a public place. It was actually a place of criminality at the time. Not many people were using it, certainly at night, but there was fantastic opportunities to turn the clock back. So we started by using elegant buildings in certain places to actually make it very functional, and that's a gymnasium and sports area that was actually put in. But we found empty spaces in which to put the buildings. We didn't clear trees to do that. We clipped them onto sort of focal walkways so they made sense. And we wanted to take people to all the corners of the park, so the buildings were very carefully placed. We put fountains at the end of grand axes, the mango trees, which occurred here. So we used what was there from the French and we adapted it. And the people came there. And at the head of the detention scheme, one of the detention ponds where you're supposed to collect silt, that was turned into an ornamental water body with the original waterfall beside it, and a very beautiful restaurant was put on top. So you hear the water, the series of waterfalls there, and you can dine outside, and it actually looks into these magnificent tropical trees, which are about 5 stories high. An exquisite piece of site conservation here, because again, the site could have been destroyed by doing this work, but in fact the reverse happened. So instantly the park was ready to open. When the pavings and lights were finished, it actually was there, which is very convincing. And the lights you see dotted around the place in the pictures actually made you could use the park at night. And again, the temperature is about 35 degrees, and the park was never used at night because it was dangerous and dark. And by adding the lights, we gave it a new life of 6 hours in the evening, when you could use it in the cool of the day, which is very important in a climate like this. There was also a zoo attached to it, which was a quite dreadful colonial zoo with leftover, with very old animals in it. And the entire thing was rethought from a sort of a good husbandry point of view, redeveloped, the number of animals kept actually reduced enormously, and focus was given to aviaries and smaller reptiles to actually make it a zoo which could be supported in an area like this. And it used the natural landscape which was already there, so it was a refurb job. Included actually lifting the dam wall, the main dam wall of the part of the detention scheme left by the French, and that turned into the most beautiful raised wetland, full of life itself, frogs and reptiles, and a great sort of focal feature of the zoo itself. You want to speak about that one?
Yeah, I mean, just if you flip through, I just wanted you to know that we've, you know, you can look at environmental design also in terms of its dry aspects. You know, you don't have to have grass everywhere. And in around these famous mosques, we're seeing here Timbuktu Mosque, and this is Mufti. These are mosques that are in urban settings and with areas around them carefully arranged, but which are purposely kept rather dry because water would damage these mosques. And then finally in Mufti, we created an Earth and Architectural Center. Takes us to, I think, the last case study, which is Zanzibar.
Okay, so Zanzibar is a small island, as you probably know, off Tanzania, famous for its history and slavery and various occupants who actually came from Oman to install a historical landscape there. So a series, it was basically used as a resort island by the Omani Arabs, is the only way to describe it. And it's got a very complex urban character in that this sort of the city part itself is very sort of finely bisected by alleys with sort of 3 or 4 story buildings attached to it, which is actually unique and very shady. You can walk from one side of the city to the other in the shade, even, you know, except for at midday. But it has this wonderful edge. So, you know, landscape often going to be about edges. So this is like the public park, this area, this promenade running along here was the public space of Stone Town. There's hardly any public space in here. This is all alleys. And so you only get sort of the areas here where I go flat, and you can actually contact one end of the city from the other is along the seafront. And it was very run down. Sea levels are rising, unequivocally the sea levels are rising here, and destroying the wall, which was built out of coral blocks and stone blocks, and had very little maintenance over the years since it was originally built, and it was actually falling apart. And a master plan was done by Sasaki landscape architects and architects in the States, and they came out with a sort of general idea, working with AKTC, to actually have a holistic plan for the restoration of Faradani Park here, which is originally where the warehousing was and some go-downs, I think they call them, for the area of storage and the operation of the sort of port here, and a seawall to protect these, which were individual palaces. So this is an incredible collection of palaces here. There's an Omani fort over here. There's a House of Wonders over there. It's a place of palaces, but highly vulnerable because the sea is not too far away from it. So there was a landscape and an engineering solution to dealing with the problems of conserving heritage. And that was just a detail of Faradani Park. Again, the existing trees were picked up because they had some sort of resonance with the original park that was there in the 1930s for King George V's Jubilee and the Sultan's Jubilee in the following year. So in fact, there was a historical layer to it. There was a layer of actually having trees there, which the Indian population there would use for toothbrushes. So everything had a message behind it. And it was very carefully analysed, and a new life was given to it by trying to find places which could be introduced, areas for play, areas for multi-purpose, the night food market, and areas for sitting in open space and shade and generally observing life that goes on in the city, but turning its back to the busy road behind with a backdrop of the monuments. So it was really a very interesting project. That's what it looked like before, but it was actually sort of falling apart. Things fall apart, as they say. So all the soil here, all the topsoil had disappeared from all these areas, and the trees were going backwards and dying. The seawall was falling down. Even this restaurant was falling down at the edge. And as you can see here, there's quite serious erosion here from the sea overtopping in this corner. So it was not doing well. It eventually would have suffered from sinkholes, which it did in certain areas of the park. There's a House of Wonders in the background. There's a reconstructed knocked down by the British in the shortest war in history in 1896. And it was rebuilt by the British, and there it is today. And it's being restored at this very moment by the Omani government. That was the park after it was restored. So the answer there was to bring all this topsoil back, look after the trees that we had, and then actually grow new plantings in new nurseries, which are actually in the back of the town, and restore all the building elements. So things like the shaded seats from the past became kiosks to serve a new use into the future. So people could come here and actually buy food and cool drinks and actually recreate. A bandstand tucked away in the corner there was restored, given new lighting. The whole park was given new lighting. So it had one life during the day as a general open green park, very much visited by local people. And in the evening, it turns into that's a multi-purpose open space just beside here. This turns into a food market at night and is used for film festivals and music festivals. So this was never a life dreamed of when it had its colonial existence, but it has to adapt to a new life in Zanzibar, which includes tourism. And tourism is the only real industry in Zanzibar at the moment. And it looks very green and inviting. I mean, this is the whole thing. It used to be a sort of a dusty, dirty place full of wild cats and refuse. And now, because it's been changed and it's being managed, it's a clean, green, safe, open space. There's the barbecue at night, tourists and jobs, locals by the day, a collection of old cannons, which was restored back. They've been distributed to all the police stations around Zanzibar. And original features, we took off postcards, black and white postcards, which we sought out, told us what to do. So it's partly restoration, partly recreation, some little bit of reinvention from time to time. But basically, it serves all the purposes that are current and means that the people there buy into it and they look after it now. They didn't before. And it's romantic. I think landscape's very romantic, and that is actually a very romantic scene and a place to eat. And even AKTC got involved with actually training the people, the catering people, who didn't quite know what to do to actually reach the standards required by tourists. So landscape architect has lots of practicalities that need to be dealt with. And the seawall was restored. There's a seawall which was actually crumbling and falling down. In fact, one or two of the buildings down here actually sort of fell down in the process before. They have been reconstructed now as hotels. And I thought this was a CGI, but it actually is reality. And these are the palm trees we transplanted in from outside and put in here to actually get back to the scale that used to exist in the days when the palaces were actually lived in by princes. And that's the continuum of it. It's all about continuing Zanzibar. The sort of the real effect of this is a long promenade all the way from the ferry terminal, which is over there, all the way past the old dispensary, which is an old kind of restored building around the corner there. This great big banyan tree, planted in 1944, believe it or not, and it's now that size, which is bigger than the buildings. And there's a series of gardens back here, but this whole area, right away from the banyan tree now, all the way through, almost to the end of the park area, has been restored. So it's finished, it's operating, it's given Zanzibar a new tourism industry, which it never had before, and which it's actually profiting from.
Well, I mentioned at the beginning, thank you, Anthony, the parks in Canada. This is of course, the Aga Khan Museum, which has an important park space. And I just will flip through with almost no comment. If those who would like to see visions of the museum, which was inaugurated a few years ago, and Edmonton Garden, which was just inaugurated, I think, last week, and some shots of it, very successful. A more contemporary interpretation of Islamic gardens and suitable for the climate in that part of the world. It's quite large, as you can see. And many of the features, you see some of these reflected in the small garden spaces in this building at nighttime use also. Well, we reached the end. We have a number of publications. This one we just showed, which it gives an overview, not just about parks and gardens, but about conservation work on monuments, socioeconomic program, etc. I suspect this is up in the library. If not, we can furnish it. Thank you for being so patient with us. We went over just a little bit over an hour, so we really could have compacted more. Maybe we should have chosen fewer examples. I understand we have some time for questions.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, we have 15
commentaries
for questions.
How do we do this? Yes, please.
So you spoke about doing detective work to figure out what the landscape was, and that must have been even more so at Humayun's tomb. It's a project I'm familiar with. I studied with Professor Shahi.
Uh-huh.
And how did you go about that? Because what it looked like 20 years ago was nothing near what a Mughal garden should look like.
Yeah.
It was a colonial
Exactly. Yeah.
lawn.
Yeah. I mean, Anthony wasn't involved in that, but I was, although not on the site every day. Well, first of all, as you know, Dr. Mohammed Shahi was a brilliant practitioner, very profound. Unfortunately, we lost him about 2 years ago. And he worked also on Baghe Babur and parts of the Khorog Shahi project. So he had a unique understanding. It started with archaeology, open trenches and, in principal areas, very carefully selected areas so that we could see the foundations of some of the channels, etc. There was a lot of research in multiple places, the ASI archives, the British Museum, library, for horticultural aspects. There were a lot of Humayun's tomb, as you say, was altered, despoiled to some extent by the colonial administration, and although they thought it was improvements, but everything's relevant. There was correspondence. I mean, it includes even people such as Lord Curzon, tampering with archaeology and horticulture. I mean, so we had a project conservation architect Ratish Nanda on site, who is passionate about the subject, and he's made it his life mission, I think, to work on Mughal gardens. He also worked on the Baghe Babur project. We brought in international specialists also, so that there would be peer reviews. UNESCO has an office in Delhi, so there would be often site meetings and discussions, of course, with the Archaeological Survey of India, ASI. All of this, over a period of 2-3 intensive years. There was a point in the project that I would visit, and I would almost despair, and I would tell Rajesh that every time I come, you dig up yet another zone in the garden. And I said, we're meant to be, landscaping, and we surely by now we know what we're doing, and he would say, yes, but I just wanted to verify something here. It was very interesting to find out old wells, which had been abandoned. The water system was complicated because it's almost flat. So to get the water to flow through all these channels and do what it's meant to be doing, you have to have extremely accurate, falls, in these channel bottoms. And that was all worked out with the help of local engineering consultants. So we knew that the water channel system was there, and it being a charbagh layout and Mughal garden, we knew what the geometry was. But I think that the tougher part was perhaps the species of plants. And Dr. Shahir was able to find sources where it confirmed more sort of fruit plant trees and so on, and flowering bushes and so on, and less the palm trees, which are those that remain are very elegant, but they're not original. I mean, Humayun's tomb didn't have palm trees in it, originally. So, but you have to be selective. If you start to cut away and chop away everything that's been added over the years, you also you run the risk,
history,
yes, that you lose some interesting history also, and that's a hard judgment.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was just wondering what the process is for going and revitalizing the areas. I know you talked about some elements of landscape architecture, but there's also an added element of community development. So I was just wondering what when you go into a site, what is the process, and how do you guys talk to the community about it? Do you correspond with other people? I know you do PDPs, but is there anything else?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We have developed a system of which I think some of the other AKDN agencies use also, which is to have we start with a baseline survey, or quality of life survey in the immediate area. And with our experience, we found that we define a catchment area for these, whatever site. So if it's Baghe Babur, or if it's the CAIRO Al-Azhar Park, we as a rule of thumb, we say that the catchment area is a zone which is within 20 minutes walking distance, which will have frequent interaction with the site, and which has a community not too large, but which you could have tangible impact measured, etc. Further away, it becomes the influence falls off and it becomes just citywide, benefits such as people coming from all over Cairo, Greater Cairo, to see the park. But our interest in the community side and social redevelopment would be in the catchment area. So we define the catchment area, and our board insists on that as well, because we've often said if you can't spatially define your project, then you don't have a project. You can't be always changing the lines and keep spreading out and doing, etc. And then the community baseline survey identifies the gaps where there are the needs. There is a striking pattern which keeps repeating, which is that in many of these communities adjacent to these old parks which have semi-dilapidated in these marginalized parts of towns, historic districts, most people are renters. They have some degree of insecurity in terms of their housing rights. They spend generally about almost 50% of their income on food for the family, which is astonishing. And there are basic, how should I put it, characteristics such as that, which we capture in the baseline survey, and then we try to track over time as the project gets going, and we create jobs, we create opportunities, etc. And we are able to measure improvements in these various indicators. There's a lady in the back. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much for bringing back my memories from Kabul and from Cairo. This question, we know that, as you as well explained, that when Azhar Park was renovated, the area around it, Darul Ahmar, was renovated as well. But when we look at the example of Baghe Babur, the area which looks like favela just next to it, the mountain area, why was that not renovated? Were there any particular reasons for that?
Yes, I mean, that's true that in that case, we were working already in the historic community, which was further, because Baghe Babur is not in the center, the geometric center of the historic Cairo, Kabul. And there was a zone which is called Ashkan wa Arafan, which is in the Chindawal area, which is really in the heart of the historic Kabul. And we had decided, because the community around Baghe Babur was basically squatter housing, and it was they didn't have there was no clarity in terms of their legal tenure. The government was not keen for us to be sort of formalizing the tenancy of those spaces, and they were poorly built. So we thought it was extremely problematic to try to do something in a short period of time. However, I didn't show you pictures, but we did improve the footpaths with steps and the water channels for drainage, etc. So we did intervene in the open spaces around that area. But we focused instead on the historic residential districts, Ashkan wa Arafan, which I couldn't show you examples of because this was focused on parks and gardens.
You did see in the Chilhilstitoon example there was empty space there, unoccupied space on the surrounding hillsides, where AKTC were able to make an intervention and actually to stabilise the slopes and to actually give a greener outlook to everybody in all directions. These fruit trees were planted there, so it actually became part of the local economy. It wasn't just an ornamental gesture. It was actually where there's an opportunity, deal with it. And they've actually grown better than anything else in the park, actually. It's remarkable how they doubled up.
I'm sorry, you were...
It's a quick question. Looking at the case studies, maybe this is very sort of straightforward, but do you think it's important to always establish a defensible edge or a barrier to delineate the park from the surrounding area?
Yeah.
I'm involved in the parts in the Arabian Peninsula where there's much less of a distinction of should we actually establish a fence or not?
You probably noticed that in the case of Forodani Park, there wasn't a fence. It was open to the streets and so on.
And that has suffered from problems of theft and lack of containment. I mean, it's the best way to put it. It's much easier, obviously, to manage a place from a very simple point of view and control numbers and control what happens in the park if you've got some means of limiting access.
But
Yeah,
for
I think
Adini,
it's
you did restore the walls to
the seawall. The seawall.
The
That's
seawall,
what
the
it's
seawall,
Yeah,
not on the other side.
yeah, not on the other
It's-
side
it's
because
totally
and there's-
connected
Yeah,
to
and
the
the
city.
people just walk in and walk out as they wish because it was like that before. One way to look at it is that these gardens historically have always had walls around them because gardens in the Middle East and South Asia, they were cultivated areas, and the wall helped to demarcate not just property lines but also what was considered cultivated, the Andarun interior from the outside area, which had no irrigation, etc. So it was really a demarcation of where you had services and so on. In the case of Baghe Babur, it was an existing wall. In the case of Lahore Fort, existing wall. Humayun's tomb, existing wall. And Chihilsitoon was an existing wall. So therefore, I mean,
That's an easy choice, but if you don't have a wall.
Yeah, the only one
reestablish
not is Azhar Park, where we have a transparent wall, which is a wrought iron wall, as you see in London in many places, with heavy shrubs to absorb sound from the highway and so on. So and then you have the historic wall, Ayyubid wall on the other side. So I think in a sense in these types of projects, walls are important because number one, they're historically there, and number two, they play a good role in terms of protection from noise and from, as you said, there still needs to be an awareness that open space should be respected and people should not just tip garbage into them, etc. And you saw how dilapidated Al-Azhar Park was. It's full of debris without the wall.
A modern example would be the park in Bamako, which, because it was in a natural area, there was certainly no walling around it. It was just an open detention area. But in fact, we had to put a transparent, see-through fence to actually make it manageable, because there were it's actually a lot of forest areas and other areas of habitat in it. And it'd be very difficult to actually police that and use it as a public park, which was safe, but people wanted to go to in the evening to be safe, not to be exposed to things which you couldn't see. So in park management, I mean, Central Park in Americas, in the States is different. But that also was dilapidated 27 years ago and had to be renovated from scratch. So it's a very difficult call.
And it's hardly safe.
It's hardly safe.
I was interested, coming at it from an entirely different angle, that you mentioned one of them, I think it was Bamako, there was an income of X and expenditure of Y. How do these parks, you mentioned it on several occasions, how are they generating income? And secondly, and I could see it's related, most of them, to a Western eye, seem to have a lot of, let's say, upper class commercial activity. To what extent do you have to incorporate all of that in order to generate the money? In other words, how does the business model work?
Yeah, well, we don't apologize for the fact that we need to make these parks financially self-sustainable, and the reason for that is because the local authorities don't have sufficient funds, number one. So they have higher priorities, health and so on, healthcare, schools and so on. So that they would not put aside the requisite amounts to maintain parks like that. And secondly, there is the beginning of these groups such as Friends of Such and Such Park, who would on a civil society basis help, and they've become starting to become more common in places, especially with historic sites like the Aleppo Citadel, which I didn't show, but in places like Bamako Park, you couldn't count on that. So yes, we have, besides doing a baseline survey, etc., we take into account the fact that when these parks are finished, they have to be maintained, and they need so much water, electricity for the lights, lamps being refueled, workers to keep the place going, horticulturally, security, all the rest. Yeah. And so I would say that the roughly, and it varies from project to project, but in some areas, most of the income could come from ticketing, basic ticketing, which are within affordable ranges, because we do surveys and ask people how much would you be willing to pay, to have a park of such and such quality. In other cases, such as in Al-Azhar Park, since we put in 2 or 3 restaurants, the restaurants generate sufficient and parking, charges for where cars are parked, that ticketing is not so critical, etc., etc. So we do these analyses, and and these sites are already, even historic sites like Humayun's tomb, Lahore Fort, etc., already have in place a ticketing charge basis for entry. If you go to the Red Fort in Delhi, yeah, you have to pay for all these places. You have to pay to enter at the moment, even before you start to touch them or get involved. So it's what is being done is to re-rationalize and try to make it to provide enough facilities which could be for the use of society, as well as be able to generate some income. Yeah. So as I said, that is one of the things that we need to do to make it self-sustainable, and therefore we think it's important. But we think that why not have restaurants? Why not have auditoriums and musical, performance spaces for musical events, which could, what's wrong with that? Because if the public likes it and if the public uses them, then, this demonstrates that there is a demand for that. And now, regarding the issue of middle class versus lower, in Al-Azhar Park, we had this discussion many times, and there were people within the municipal authority, the governor of CAIRO, who said, this will never work. You can't mix upper class, high income people with low income people. And we said, just wait, watch. We do have, low income people coming, and in the community adjacent, they have a subsidized. Yes, even with ticketing. You see, the people in Jabal Ahmar are given, as residents in the adjacent community, they have seasonal passes, which are subsidized, and because really Al-Azhar Park is a neighborhood park for them. So we felt it would be bizarre to have a major park, a sophisticated park, and for them to be excluded price-wise. There are also special days when the park is free, and there are special discounts for families, etc., etc. So in other words, they are used by and large by all parts of. We, from what we can tell, the spectrum. We do surveys. We conduct what we call the Park Information Management System, where we track as much as we can of these things, and we ask people visiting and so on. I suspect that we get a lot of young people who want to escape their households and their parents and their and their school system, who come and so on, and they're and we have a lot of elderly people who want a quiet, decent environment to be in, and then there are families on weekends particularly, etc. So you have very interesting dynamics of different groups using the park at different times of the day and the week and so on. And I really in CAIRO I tend to see it as very much fairly well balanced in that sense. In Bamako, I suspect it's mostly just the general public, because I think those who are, who are wealthy have their houses with their swimming pools, and they don't need to go out, and if they don't want to mix with other people, etc. So that's another phenomenon, that it may be that we don't satisfy the very high income people.
Yeah. Now the ordinary people really value it. The problem is parks themselves, all parks, are very expensive. I mean, that's why there's the premise of kings and rich people have their own parks, like golf courses. But if you want a public park, you've still got to actually have funds coming in from somewhere. Yes. And if you don't ring fence them, they tend to disappear off into other civilian projects, like sewage works over there and who knows, presidential campaign over there. So it's very important that there's a consistent, with horticultural development, you can't have inconsistent funding. You can't let the park die one year. You can't not actually repair the irrigation. You can't not continue to conserve old buildings if conservation is a part of it, or you can't not continue to sort of take alien species out of natural botanical areas. So there has to be some form of it. It can either come from the government or from the outside, but if the park is generating itself, then the chances of it surviving into the future are a lot better, and that then serves everybody.
Well, I'm not sure the system in the UK, but in France it's very common. If you want to go to Versailles, the Chateau de Chantilly, Vaux-le-Vicomte, Fontainebleau, etc., you have to pay 15 plus euros to get in. So it's, again, the same principle.
It's just a lead on to this. I mean, you spoke about parks and open spaces being an ordering system for cities, and how ordinary people, their lives are lived out in there. And, out of many examples, Isfahan or parts of the walled city of Lahore, and the walled city of Delhi is now, of course, a cauterized city. It doesn't exist as it once was. What about that aspect? I mean, almost everything we looked at was parks as horticultural exercises to some extent, with archaeology or heritage monuments attached to them. But what about the notion of open spaces that are very much the lungs and the living open, activity zones of cities? Is that something?
It's an important issue, but I would say, first of all, that there are very far few in reality in these cities. In Delhi, perhaps in New Delhi, you have, thanks to Lutyens and the work of these people, you have vast open spaces if you want to talk about it. But I challenge you to walk around Shah Jahanabad and find many parks.
Aren't any.
Yes, of course. So, now the problem is is one of confiscation of property to kick out people is a controversial thing. We, being a historic cities program, we have been naturally focusing on historic gardens, World Heritage sites and all the rest, where you're right, we work on largish parks. We don't work on many smallish little parks. Although in Nizamuddin Basti, we did work on
the Baradri.
Yes, exactly. Small parks, the Nala, etc. But those are, and those are interesting projects, but they're smaller, they're more, they're what they can offer is more restricted, but they serve the public. You're right. But there is one park in Kabul that we created, which is just a community park called Baghe Ghazi, which is about 1 hectare in size, which has a little sports field with for soccer for the kids and some very modest landscape because the budget was limited. But it's meant to be just that for the community.
But I think the question is about ring fencing. So if those funds, which are supposed to be for city or for urban maintenance, were available to create those spaces, those public spaces that are not necessarily parks, that are essential. I mean, you couldn't not have an open space because you need a public square. It's going to be there where there's a crossroad. It's going to be there where there are, places in traditional, in historic towns of the East and the West. They're always there.
Yeah, I mean, there are many opportunities to be tapped, for sure. We, with some of the surpluses that we've been able to generate, we've sort of given priority to building clinics for the public to come and for basic health checkups and so on, or which seem to be a higher demand. When you remember, we did a baseline survey, and having a green space is one item, but it's not at the top of the list. There've been one of the issues has been creating jobs. Another one has been to have clean running water. A third one is to have some public toilets. A fourth one is better school facilities, etc. So you have to weigh all of these things. And when you do a project, an area project like the Delhi Nizamuddin project, and considering how much attention has gone into the Humayun's Tomb garden space and Sundar Nursery, we felt at least in Nizamuddin Basti, we should not just go there and start doing green spaces only, but we should really focus on some community essential services, which is why, I mean, and of course, we have to always remember that there's only so much we can do with our resources. We can't do everything.
I think when you have a natural system like, say, a river course or a drainage course, you're actually coming into some of these parks, then that needs to be dealt with in a different way rather than sort of, a park sort of design exercise. It needs to be done as a sort of part of the natural infrastructure. And in the example of Bamako, the actual area designated for the park wasn't just the piece you saw where the actual park is and the zoo. There was a much greater raft of land that went right way around the mountain at the back of Bamako, and actually was part of a natural park area. So a bit like where I come from in Cape Town, we have sort of an organised botanical garden at the bottom, and then mountainside of actually sort of wild woodland, and then the mountain on the top. And that sort of vision of going from one ecosystem, let's say an urban ecosystem, into an ecosystem wrapping around the mountain was, and the idea at the back of Bamako, that phase never happened because it stopped at the end of the zoo. It's the second phase. But these things are designed as a chain of events, not just in isolation. Where there's the opportunity for that? If it's just a Mughal garden which has a very set boundary, that's a different matter. But any time you engage a natural system, then you've actually got to engage with, especially stormwater and drainage, because they will defeat you in every case. In fact, a stream goes right the way through the middle of the Chihilsitoon garden. It's in a pipe at the moment, and it pops out on the other side because the old garden, parkland landscape could not cope with the new flows of water from the uphill urban area.
Very technical, but maybe one time we can give a tour on site one day to people.
We will take one or two more questions because our fabulous speakers, you have spoken almost for nearly 2 hours now.
Yeah. So, Stefan, you choose the speakers.
Yes,
you go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank
And it's very interesting. The brief images you gave about Lahore. I've just returned from Lahore actually, by the way, on holiday. And how did you manage the hot weather there? Both of you have been to a hotter places. How did you cope with the weather? And how did you survive in that weather? That's not my question.
Yeah.
Then my question is,
With some difficulty.
Garden,
Yeah.
you haven't actually shown that one. You haven't got one.
Yeah.
In Delhi, you got a Humayun's tomb. In Lahore, you got a Chihilsitoon, similar.
Yes.
You haven't actually shown that.
In Shadara. Shadara.
And also Nur Jahan's tomb in Lahore.
Yeah. Those
so actually you haven't done justice to Lahore, really. You haven't shown.
I appreciate your expression of desire for us to solve all problems in Lahore, but maybe with time. But you have to realize that there are limits to what we can do. But we think Lahore Fort is quite a mouthful at the moment.
We have another last question.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you to sort of close the discussion tonight to place the parks and gardens as agents of change within the Historic Cities program, which didn't start from parks and gardens, but started from historic cities. Is this a direction that you're pursuing more and more?
No, that's a fair question. Parks and gardens, because of their size, have become, in terms of weight in our portfolio, they're an important weight. We started with single monuments in Karimabad, Baltic Fort, Altit Fort, the Stone Town Cultural Center. I would say this, that yes, our board has felt that after the first 5-6 years of doing this, they felt that working on single sites, single monument sites was not what they desired us to be doing as the main mission. They wanted us to work on a area development project and it turned out that after, as I mentioned earlier, CAIRO Park, Al-Azhar Park, it was seen to be quite successful, and people came to us. I mean, we didn't go after, people actually approached us from Aleppo, from elsewhere, to at Lahore. The World Bank came to us and said, can you work with us on similar type of work? So they say that that appreciation of this type is one of the best forms of flattery. That you're appreciated. That means a lot for NGOs who are trying to figure out how to be beneficial. We're not UNESCO, that we're limited only to a heritage site, and we're not archaeologists in the sense that Stefan Fradin is, that we would focus on a archaeological site maybe for 10 years and not go beyond that. We really want to look at social issues, and we find parks are a very interesting, how should I put it, leitmotif and an agent for social interaction and change. That's the whole point. We found out in Al-Azhar Park that was the case because as we said earlier, different categories of people mix. They start to appreciate nature, and from the park they begin to understand better the importance of environmental standards, good horticultural, and appreciate their actual urban scape. So they've been very good, of course, provided that you can couple it with a adjacent community, which is what our other interest is, and which we've done. I think usually we've been able to succeed in that.
I guess my question was within your area-based conservation, which is something that you pioneered, actually.
Yes.
With success, if the garden and parks are taking a major part in the portfolio.
They have always, since 1994, been a major part, and so nothing's changed. We're not obliged to, we don't set targets and say you must always have, Right now in Kabul, for example, after doing 2 major parks, we're working in the central part of town on the Kabul riverfront area project, which includes large areas of the urban terrain and urbanscape plus the riverfront, etc. So there's no park there. Yeah. And that's another 3-year project with 100% funded by the Germans. So there are opportunities which come along, yeah. But we don't have any fixed rules that we say you have to do this or you have to do that. But we've been able to gain a certain level of, I would say, achievements in this respect, as well as working on the Silk Route with tourism and guest houses, restored guest houses in northern Pakistan, which are explained in the book that I showed at the end.
Thank you. Please join me to thank and congratulate